The easiest people to buy are often the ones who have never been offered enough money. On a rainy Thursday evening, Hawthorne House glowed with quiet elegance beneath crystal chandeliers, welcoming Manhattan's wealthiest guests with polished silver, warm candlelight, and flawless service. Emily Brooks moved gracefully through the dining room wearing a simple black waitress uniform and a neatly pressed white apron, balancing a tray with steady hands that never betrayed how exhausted she felt after working 2 jobs every week. Most customers noticed only the smile she offered with every meal. None of them noticed the discipline behind it. At the far end of the restaurant, behind frosted glass doors reserved for private dining, sat William Hayes, one of the country's most respected billionaires. Magazine covers called him a visionary. Investors called him unstoppable. Employees called him demanding. Tonight, however, he looked like a man carrying something far heavier than success. Emily quietly entered the private dining room carrying a fresh pot of coffee. William thanked her with a polite nod, unusual for someone whose attention rarely drifted from business. As she poured the coffee into his cup, she noticed a thick ivory envelope resting beside his untouched dessert plate. It had no name written on the front. No company logo. No seal. William waited until she finished before speaking in a calm voice that seemed strangely uncertain. "Miss Brooks, may I ask you for 5 minutes of your time after your shift ends?" Emily looked at him with professional courtesy. "If the manager approves, of course." William nodded. "That is all I need. Nothing more." Hours later, after the last guests had left and the dining room had fallen almost silent, Emily stepped into the same private room. The candles had nearly burned down. Rain traced slow lines across the tall windows overlooking the city. William remained seated exactly where she had left him earlier. Without saying a word, he gently pushed the ivory envelope across the polished table toward her. Emily looked at it but made no effort to touch it. William finally broke the silence. "There are $2 million inside," he said quietly. "It is yours if you agree to keep something confidential." Emily's expression did not change. She neither gasped nor reached for the envelope. She simply looked from the envelope to William's face, searching for something beyond the astonishing number he had just spoken. William expected disbelief. He expected questions. Perhaps even excitement. Instead, Emily calmly folded her hands together and asked one simple question that he had not prepared to answer. "Before I decide anything, may I ask why you believe money should be the first thing you offer me?" For the first time in years, William Hayes found himself sitting across from someone who seemed completely untouched by the power that had opened every other door in his life. William Hayes did not answer immediately. The question lingered between them like the sound of rain against the tall windows, soft but impossible to ignore. He slowly leaned back in his chair, studying Emily Brooks with the same careful attention he usually reserved for negotiations worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Yet this conversation felt different. Every business meeting in his career had begun with numbers. Every agreement had eventually found its price. Emily had quietly dismissed both within seconds. She had not even looked inside the envelope. That alone unsettled him more than refusal ever could. Emily remained standing beside the table, her posture relaxed, her hands folded naturally in front of her apron. She had finished her shift almost 30 minutes earlier, but there was no sign of impatience on her face. She simply waited. William finally spoke. "Because money has solved almost every difficult conversation I have ever had." Emily nodded thoughtfully. "That sounds exhausting." William frowned slightly, surprised by the answer. Most people called his success impressive. She had called it exhausting. He almost smiled before stopping himself. Emily pulled out the empty chair across from him only after he gave a small nod of permission. She sat down without touching the envelope that still rested exactly where he had placed it. The room remained quiet except for the distant sound of dishes being washed somewhere. Beyond the dining room. William looked toward the envelope. "You are not even curious." Emily answered honestly. Of course I am curious. Curiosity and trust are not the same thing. William rested his hands on the polished table. You know there is enough money inside to change your life. Emily glanced toward the rain outside. It could change my circumstances. That does not necessarily mean it would improve my life. William found himself without another immediate response. He had expected disbelief. He had expected excitement. Instead he found principles that refused to move. Emily thought briefly about the overdue mortgage payments on her mother's small house, the aging car that needed another expensive repair, and the student loans she still carried years after leaving college. $2 million would erase every one of those burdens before sunrise. Yet something about accepting money before understanding the truth felt heavier than every financial problem she had ever faced. She returned her attention to William. If your secret deserves compassion, you should begin with honesty. If it deserves silence, it should not need to be purchased. William slowly lowered his eyes to the untouched envelope. For the first time in many years, he realized he was sitting across from someone who valued a clear conscience more than an extraordinary fortune. William lifted the ivory envelope with deliberate care and placed it back beside his own chair instead of pushing it toward Emily again. The gesture surprised even him. It was the first negotiation he had entered where removing the money felt more important than presenting it. Emily noticed the movement but said nothing. She simply waited with the quiet patience that had already unsettled every assumption William had carried into the room. Outside, the rain continued washing the city lights into blurred reflections across the tall windows. Inside, the silence felt unusually honest. William finally drew a slow breath. The secret is not about a crime, he said quietly. It is about someone I have spent years protecting. Emily listened without interrupting. William looked toward the empty dining room before continuing. 20 years ago, before anyone knew my name, someone made an extraordinary sacrifice so I could build the life I have today. That person never wanted recognition. They disappeared from my life, and I honored that wish. Last week, a reporter discovered enough pieces of the story to begin asking questions. If the truth is published without context, people will believe I abandoned the person who helped me most. Emily studied his expression. For the first time that evening, she no longer saw the billionaire admired by financial magazines. She saw a man carrying years of gratitude mixed with regret. William folded his hands together. Earlier tonight, you accidentally overheard part of my conversation with my attorney when you refilled our coffee. You heard enough to recognize names if anyone ever asked you. I assumed the safest solution was to buy your silence before someone else tried to buy your story. Emily lowered her eyes for a brief moment before looking back at him. You assumed I would eventually sell my integrity to the highest bidder. William answered with complete honesty. Yes. Emily nodded slowly. Thank you for telling me the truth instead of giving me another polished explanation. William looked genuinely puzzled. You are thanking me? Emily smiled gently. Honesty is always a better place to begin than money. William leaned back in his chair, absorbing her words. Every advisor he had ever hired began by calculating risk. Emily had begun by measuring character. The difference was impossible to ignore. She stood from her chair, smoothing the front of her apron before speaking once more. Mr. Hayes, whether I know your secret or not, my decisions cannot be purchased. They have to be earned. William watched her with quiet disbelief. In every boardroom he had ever entered, influence had belonged to the person with the greatest resources. Tonight, in an empty restaurant after closing time, he realized influence had quietly shifted to the one person who refused to put a price on her conscience. Emily reached for the empty coffee pot instead of the envelope, giving herself a quiet reason to stand before returning to the table. She refilled William's cup with slow, practiced movements, the same way she had served hundreds of guests who carried invisible burdens behind expensive watches and tailored suits. When she sat down again, the envelope remained exactly where it had been from the beginning. Neither of them seemed interested in moving it anymore. William watched the steam rise from the coffee before speaking again. "There is something else you should know." Emily nodded gently, encouraging him to continue without pressure. He looked toward the rain-covered windows as though searching for the right words beyond the city lights. "The person who helped me all those years ago refused every reward I offered afterward. They said gratitude should never become a transaction. I promised I would respect that wish." Emily listened quietly. "Then why offer me money tonight?" William gave a faint smile filled with disappointment in himself. "Because somewhere along the way I forgot the lesson they tried to teach me. Success slowly convinced me that every difficult problem could be solved with another check." Emily lowered her eyes for a moment before answering. "Sometimes fear speaks louder than wisdom." William looked at her with genuine curiosity. "Fear?" Emily nodded. "You were not trying to buy silence. You were trying to protect someone you still feel responsible for. Those are not the same thing." William remained silent. She had uncovered the truth behind his decision with only a few careful observations. No investigator had questioned him so accurately. No executive coach had described his motives so clearly. Emily continued in the same calm voice. "I do not think you came here expecting someone to keep your secret. I think you came here hoping someone would tell you whether you were handling it the right way." William slowly exhaled, almost relieved by the realization. He had spent days listening to attorneys discuss reputation, financial exposure, and public perception. Not one of them had asked what choice would allow him to live with himself afterward. Emily folded her hands together on the polished table. "If the person you are protecting chose dignity over money once, perhaps honoring that same value today is the only decision that truly respects them." William glanced once more at the ivory envelope before quietly sliding it back into his leather briefcase. For the first time since entering the restaurant, he no longer felt as though the money represented security. It had become a reminder of how easily fear could disguise itself as generosity. Across the silent dining room, the last candle flickered softly before settling into a steady glow, and William realized that the conversation he thought would purchase peace of mind had instead begun teaching him what peace actually required. Neither of them noticed how much time had passed until the restaurant manager quietly walked by the private dining room, smiled politely through the glass door, and switched off the final row of lights in the empty dining area. Only the warm glow above their table remained, wrapping the room in a calm silence that felt more like reflection than conversation. William rested one hand on his briefcase without opening it again. The envelope no longer seemed important. Emily noticed the change immediately. Money had entered the room with confidence. Now it sat quietly in the shadows, almost forgotten. William looked at her with sincere curiosity. "Tell me something honestly. If you had opened that envelope before asking me a single question, would you have judged yourself differently afterward?" Emily considered the question instead of answering too quickly. "My mother always told me that difficult choices become easier when you decide who you are before the decision arrives. If I wait until temptation appears, I have already made the situation harder than it needs to be." William listened carefully. Those words reminded him of advice he had once heard decades earlier from the very person whose sacrifice had changed his life. He had built companies by making fast decisions under pressure, yet somewhere along the way he had stopped asking whether those decisions reflected the person he wanted to become. Emily stood and quietly gathered the empty coffee cups from the table. Even after such an unusual conversation, she completed the simple task with the same care she showed every customer. William watched her straighten the silver spoon beside the saucer before placing everything neatly onto the tray. Nothing about her suggested she believed she had just influenced one of the wealthiest men in America. She simply did what she believed was right. As Emily reached the doorway, William spoke again. "There is one more reason I asked to meet you tonight." She turned back. He offered a faint smile that carried more humility than confidence. "I wanted someone outside my world to tell me whether I had become the kind of man I promised myself I would never become." Emily remained quiet for a long moment before answering. People do not lose themselves all at once. They lose themselves one small compromise at a time. The good news is that they also find themselves the same way. One honest choice at a time. William lowered his eyes as those words settled deeply within him. He had entered the restaurant believing he needed silence from a stranger. Instead, he had received something far more valuable. A mirror that reflected not his reputation, but his character. For the first time in many years, he felt grateful that someone had refused everything he believed could solve the problem. Emily carried the tray toward the kitchen, but William's final words followed her long after the dining room disappeared behind the swinging doors. She washed the coffee cups, folded clean linens, and completed the last closing tasks with the same quiet precision she brought to every shift. Nothing in her routine changed, yet something about the evening refused to leave her thoughts. She had met wealthy guests before. She had listened to conversations about investments, luxury homes, and private jets while silently refilling water glasses. Tonight had been different. For the first time, she had watched someone with enormous influence admit uncertainty without trying to hide behind confidence. As she hung her apron inside the staff room, the restaurant manager smiled. "Long night?" Emily returned the smile. "A thoughtful one." She stepped outside into the cool night air where the rain had finally stopped. Across the street, William remained seated alone inside a black sedan, the engine still off. Through the windshield he watched Emily leave the restaurant carrying nothing more than her small canvas bag. She walked toward the subway entrance instead of calling a ride, disappearing into the crowd exactly as she had arrived that morning. William realized she had just declined an amount of money that many people spent an entire lifetime hoping to earn. Yet she walked away with the calm expression of someone who had lost nothing at all. His driver quietly asked, "Should we head home, sir?" William looked once more toward the empty sidewalk. "Not yet." A few minutes later he opened the briefcase resting beside him and removed the ivory envelope. For several seconds he simply held it before slowly taking out the certified check. $2 million had once represented certainty. Tonight it looked surprisingly ordinary. He folded the check in half, placed it inside another folder, and closed the briefcase again. Tomorrow, he thought, that money would become something entirely different. Not a payment. Not an incentive. Something meaningful. At the same time, Emily descended the subway stairs surrounded by teachers, nurses, construction workers, students, and office employees returning home after long days. She stood quietly among strangers, thinking about William's face when he admitted he no longer recognized the person he had become. Her father had once told her that every person carries a story hidden behind the version the world applauds. Tonight those words felt more real than ever. As the train arrived with a rush of cool air, Emily stepped inside believing the conversation had ended. She did not know that William had already made a decision that would change both of their lives, not through money, but through the courage to correct the mistake he had finally learned to recognize. The following Monday morning, Carter Global Headquarters overlooked Manhattan beneath a clear autumn sky, yet William Hayes found himself paying little attention to the breathtaking view outside his office. For years he had begun every week by reviewing financial reports before the first meeting. This morning, the first document resting on his desk was neither a contract nor a quarterly forecast. It was a handwritten page listing the promises he had once made to himself before success became the center of every decision. He quietly read each sentence again. Never confuse gratitude with obligation. Never allow fear to become leadership. Never use wealth to replace trust. The words had not changed in 20 years. He had. Across town, Emily Brooks arrived at Hawthorne House before sunrise to prepare for the breakfast shift. She polished glasses, arranged fresh flowers, and carefully aligned every table setting exactly as she did every morning. Her co-workers chatted about weekend plans while soft jazz drifted through the empty dining room. Emily smiled politely, yet part of her still reflected on William's final expression before she left the restaurant. It had not been relief. It had been recognition. Later that afternoon, William asked his executive assistant to locate the individual whose sacrifice had shaped his early career. The search had quietly continued for years with little progress, but this time his instructions were different. "Do not offer money," he said calmly. "Do not promise rewards. Simply tell them there is someone who wishes to express gratitude in person if they are willing." His assistant looked surprised by the unusual request but nodded without hesitation. When the office finally emptied that evening, William opened the same briefcase once again. The certified check remained untouched inside its folder. He looked at it for a long moment before placing it into a charitable foundation account that provided scholarships for students working their way through college. It felt strangely appropriate. Money that had almost been used to purchase silence would instead create opportunities without asking for anything in return. At nearly the same hour, Emily finished another long shift and stepped outside carrying a small grocery bag instead of an expensive purse. As she walked home through quiet neighborhood streets, she passed a community library where children were gathering for an evening reading program. She paused for a moment, smiling as volunteers welcomed every child with patience and encouragement. Her father had always believed that the strongest communities were built by ordinary people making quiet decisions every day. Emily continued walking with that thought in her heart, unaware that William's greatest victory would no longer appear on a financial statement. It had begun the moment someone with no power over his fortune showed him that true wealth could only grow where integrity came first. 2 weeks passed before William Hayes returned to Hawthorne House, but this time there was no private dining room waiting for him and no briefcase resting beside his chair. He arrived just before the dinner rush wearing the same tailored navy suit, yet something about his presence felt lighter. He asked for a table in the main dining room instead of requesting privacy. When Emily Brooks approached with a menu, she greeted him exactly as she greeted every guest. "Good evening, Mr. Hayes. It is nice to see you again." William smiled warmly. "It is nice to see you too, Miss Brooks." There was no envelope between them. No hidden proposal. No impossible decision waiting on the table. Emily noticed the difference immediately. After taking his order, she turned to leave, but William spoke softly before she could walk away. "I came back for a different reason tonight." Emily paused with quiet curiosity. "I realized our last conversation ended with me asking you to protect something for me. I never thanked you for protecting something even more important." Emily looked at him thoughtfully. "What was that?" William answered without hesitation. "My ability to become a better man." The words settled gently between them. Emily did not respond right away. She simply nodded with the calm understanding that had first challenged him weeks earlier. Throughout the evening she served William the same way she served every other guest, never giving him special treatment because of his wealth or his gratitude. When dessert arrived, William noticed a small handwritten card resting beside the plate. It was not from the restaurant. Emily had written only a single sentence before placing it there. "Every honest choice becomes the beginning of another." William read the line twice before carefully folding the card and placing it inside his wallet. When the meal ended, he stood near the entrance as Emily finished helping another family gather their coats. Only then did he approach her one final time. "I found the person who helped me all those years ago," he said quietly. "They agreed to meet with me next month." Emily's eyes brightened with genuine happiness. "Then you already received the greatest gift this conversation could have given you." William nodded. "I almost missed that because I was too focused on protecting my reputation." Emily smiled gently. "Sometimes we protect our image so carefully that we forget to protect our character." William extended his hand, not as a billionaire closing a deal, but as one person expressing sincere respect to another. Emily shook his hand with quiet confidence before returning to welcome a newly arrived couple into the restaurant. William stepped outside into the cool evening air carrying no secret burden, no unfinished bargain, and no illusion that respect could ever be purchased. It had to be earned, one honest decision at a time. Several months later, the conversation that had begun in a quiet corner of Hawthorne House lived on in ways neither William Hayes nor Emily Brooks could have predicted. William still carried the small handwritten card inside his wallet, not because of the words themselves, but because they reminded him of the evening he stopped measuring every problem by its financial value. The meeting with the person who had changed the course of his early life had brought neither headlines nor public attention. It brought something far more meaningful. A chance to say thank you face to face after years of silence. When he returned to Carter Global, his employees noticed subtle changes before anyone could explain them. Meetings became shorter and more honest. Young associates found their ideas welcomed instead of dismissed. Scholarships quietly expanded through the foundation without press releases or interviews. William no longer felt the need to prove generosity. He simply practiced it. Across the city, Emily Brooks continued working at Hawthorne House exactly as she always had. Guests came and went. Anniversaries were celebrated. Business deals were signed over candlelit dinners. Families gathered around beautifully prepared meals. To every person who entered the restaurant, Emily offered the same patience, kindness, and quiet attention that had once transformed the heart of a stranger. She never mentioned the envelope, the conversation, or the billionaire. To her, integrity only mattered if it remained consistent when no one was watching. One evening, as she prepared a table near the window, she noticed a familiar leather wallet resting beside a reservation card. William had accidentally left it behind after meeting a client. She opened it only far enough to identify its owner before noticing the folded handwritten card still tucked inside. She smiled gently, closed the wallet immediately, and returned it to him before he even realized it was missing. William accepted it with grateful relief. "I suppose some things never change," he said with a warm smile. Emily nodded. "The important ones should not." They shared a quiet laugh before another group of guests entered the restaurant, and Emily excused herself to welcome them with the same calm grace she had shown on the very first evening they met. William watched her for a moment before walking toward the exit. The city outside remained loud, fast, and endlessly ambitious, but he no longer believed that greatness announced itself through wealth or influence alone. Sometimes it wore a simple black apron, carried a coffee pot with steady hands, and spoke the truth without asking for anything in return. And sometimes the greatest fortune a person could ever receive was meeting someone who reminded them that character is never something you purchase. It is something you choose, one quiet decision at a time.